Welcome back to another edition of Literary Diss Tracks. Today we have the modernist poet Wallace Stevens versus the original Florida man, Ernest Hemingway. Some of the literary diss tracks I've covered thus far are based on really meaningful, or at least substantive, debates about literature, raising these thought-provoking questions about the role and responsibility of literature in the world. This is not that kind. This is two writers who separately claim the mantle of masculinity, getting into a gnarly fistfight in the streets of Key West, Florida. But I'll try to bring in some literary discussion as well, just for the sake of my own sanity. First, let it be said that there are some notable similarities between Hemingway and Stevens. Hemingway's very hyperbolic performance of masculinity is relatively well known. He was obsessed with bullfighting, boxing, safaris, deep-sea fishing, big game hunting, and he was a decorated World War I veteran. Indeed, his idiosyncratic minimalist prose is often described as being masculine and muscular. In this regard, Wallace Stevens is kind of similar. If you're really familiar with Hemingway, Stevens' poems sometimes read as if they're written by someone like Hemingway. Take, for example, these stanzas from Stevens' poem, Poetry is a Destructive Force, in which he's characterizing poetry, or the concept of misery, depending on how you read it, as, quote, "He is like a man in the body of a violent beast. Its muscles are his own. The lion sleeps in the sun. Its nose is on its paws. It can kill a man." Unlike Hemingway, though, Stevens didn't live the same life of swashbuckling adventure. For most of his life, he was an insurance salesman who wrote poetry on the side. And unlike Hemingway, Stevens did not like Hemingway. The two meet in Key West in 1936. Hemingway lived there at this time, and Stevens is in town visiting with a business associate. As Hemingway would later describe Stevens' arrival in Key West in a letter to his friend Sarah Murphy, quote, "Stevens came again, sort of pleasant, like the cholera." This is also a good time to point out that the incident I'm about to relate to you is documented primarily by Hemingway in this letter to Sarah Murphy, though the important details are also supported by Stevens' biographer. It's just worth keeping in mind, though, that these details are almost certainly embellished because, it's Hemingway we're talking about. As Hemingway recounts the incident, it begins when his sister Ursula had been at a nearby cocktail party, quote, "at which Mr. Stevens had made her cry by telling her forcefully what a sap I was, no man, etc. So I said, this was a week ago, all right, that's the third time we've had enough of Mr. Stevens." Evidently, this was not the first time that Stevens had been bad-mouthing Hemingway behind his back. So Hemingway says that he then, quote, "headed out into the rainy past twilight and met Mr. Stevens, who was just issuing from the door, having just said, I learned later, 'By God, I wish I had that Hemingway here now. I'd knock him out with a single punch.'" He gets his wish, but he misses that initial punch, and Hemingway claims to have then knocked him down 3 separate times in the street. However, evidently an onlooker claimed that it was not a fair fight, as Hemingway was wearing glasses. And upon taking them off, Stevens does land a punch on Hemingway. Here's Hemingway's description of that punch. Quote, "Mr. Stevens hit me flush on the jaw with his Sunday punch, bam, like that. And this is very funny. Broke his hand in 2 places. Didn't harm my jaw at all, and so put him down again and then fixed him good, so he was in his room for 5 days with a nurse and doctor working on him." He adds in the letter to Sarah Murphy here, quote, "but you mustn't tell this to anybody." Yeah, right, dude. You love this. Important to note here also that Stevens was in his late 50s at the time and Hemingway in his 30s. Also, Hemingway was a trained boxer. It's not really close to a fair fight no matter how you cut it, but Hemingway, who is definitely aware of this fact, tried to spin it, saying that he, quote, "was very pleased last night to see how large Mr. Stevens was, and am sure that if I had had a good look at him before it all started, would not have felt up to hitting him." Let's pause here to note that Stevens and Hemingway were roughly the same height, Hemingway at 6 foot, and Stevens closer to 6'2". Nonetheless, Hemingway continues, quote, "but can assure you that there is no one like Mr. Stevens to go down in a spectacular fashion, especially into a large puddle of water. I think he is really one of those mirror fighters who swells his muscles and practices lethal punches in the bathroom while he hates his betters." Now, evidently, Stevens would later apologize to Hemingway for bad-mouthing him behind his back, and the two made up. They even agreed on a cover story for Stevens to help explain his injuries, a story in which Stevens just fell down the stairs, which helped him explain to his wife his poor penmanship in their correspondences. Evidently, his wife would not have been too impressed by her husband fist-fighting Ernest Hemingway in the streets of Key West. But Hemingway himself was not necessarily apologetic, saying without really any trace of irony even, quote, "But on mature reflection, I don't know anybody needed to be hit worse than Mr. S." So let me know who you got in this one, Wallace Stevens or Ernest Hemingway, or are you content to just watch two full-grown men grapple in the streets of Key West without feeling like you need to take a side?